I'm Callista, 25 years old, and everything changed when my father shoved a marriage contract at me on my 17th birthday. The papers were thick, expensive-looking, with Barrett Langley's signature already scrawled across the bottom in blue ink. "Sign it," Damien commanded, his voice cutting through the suffocating silence of his study. The room smelled like leather and disappointment, the same smell that had followed me through 17 years of living in the Voss household. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me as I share how choosing the streets over a forced marriage led me to a life I never could have imagined. Growing up as Damien Voss's daughter meant understanding that love came with conditions, and children were investments, not individuals. My father built his real estate empire through calculated moves and strategic partnerships, treating every relationship like a business transaction waiting to be optimized. Eleanor, my mother, had learned early in their marriage to smile at the right moments and stay silent during the negotiations that shaped our family's trajectory. She taught me the same survival skills through subtle corrections and meaningful glances across dinner tables, where business partners evaluated our family's value like livestock at auction. The contract Barrett Langley brought to our house that October evening represented months of behind-the-scenes discussions I'd been excluded from entirely. He was 63 years old, recently divorced from his third wife, and owned a chain of luxury hotels across the Midwest. His handshake lingered too long when he greeted me, his eyes tracking over my body in a way that made my skin crawl. During dinner, he spoke about his properties and his need for a young, sophisticated wife who could represent his brand at industry events. I sat frozen as my parents nodded along, Eleanor refilling his wine glass, and Damien laughing at jokes that weren't funny. "Barrett has been very generous with his offer," my father explained, sliding the contract closer to where I sat. "He's willing to pay off our current debts and provide a substantial dowry. Plus, you'll have access to his homes in Chicago, Miami, and Aspen." The way he spoke made it sound like he was offering me a vacation package, rather than selling me to a man old enough to be my grandfather. Eleanor's manicured fingers drummed against the mahogany table, her wedding ring catching the light from the chandelier that had been in our family for 3 generations and would likely be sold next month if this deal didn't go through. I'd known for months that our family's finances were deteriorating. The whispered phone calls that stopped when I entered rooms, the gradual disappearance of household staff, the way Franklin Carr visited more frequently with increasingly serious expressions. My father's real estate ventures had failed spectacularly during the market downturn, leaving him leveraged beyond recovery and desperate for solutions that didn't involve bankruptcy court. Barrett Langley represented salvation, a wealthy older man willing to absorb our family's debt in exchange for a teenage bride who could provide him with the social respectability his money couldn't buy. "I won't sign it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The contract sat between us like a death sentence, its legal language outlining the terms of my surrender. Damien's face darkened, the charming mask he wore for business partners sliding away to reveal the cold calculation underneath. "You'll sign it, or you'll find somewhere else to live," he said, his tone carrying the weight of absolute finality. "Barrett has been more than patient with this arrangement, and I won't have my daughter's selfishness destroy this family's future." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice carrying the practiced sweetness she used when entertaining guests. "Darling, Mr. Langley is offering you opportunities most girls your age could never dream of. You'll have financial security, social status, beautiful homes. Many women would be grateful for such a generous arrangement." Her words felt like ice water in my veins, the realization that my own mother viewed me as a commodity to be traded, rather than a daughter to be protected. She'd been raised in the same transactional environment, married off to my father when she was 19, in a deal that benefited both families financially. The clock on the wall ticked past 9 p.m. as Barrett Langley outlined his expectations for our marriage. He wanted children within the first 2 years, preferably sons who could inherit his hotel empire. He expected me to maintain a certain appearance, undergo etiquette training, and represent his brand at charity galas and business functions. The prenuptial agreement was ironclad, ensuring that any divorce would leave me with nothing while protecting his assets entirely. As he spoke, I watched my parents' faces, searching for any sign of hesitation or protective instinct. Instead, I saw relief and anticipation, the expressions of people whose financial problems were about to be solved through their daughter's sacrifice. When I tore the contract in half, the sound of ripping paper seemed to echo through the study like a gunshot. Damien's face turned purple with rage, while Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace in shock. Barrett Langley's expression shifted from confident expectation to cold fury, his mask of gentlemanly charm disappearing entirely. "Get out," my father snarled, standing so abruptly that his chair toppled backward. "If you're not willing to contribute to this family, then you're not part of this family. Pack whatever you can carry and leave my house tonight." I spent that first night shivering in a 24-hour laundromat 6 miles from our estate, watching my breath form clouds in the unheated space while strangers' clothes tumbled in mechanical cycles around me. The first week on the streets taught me that survival required abandoning every assumption I'd held about basic human dignity. My designer clothes marked me as a target in the shelters, so I traded my cashmere sweater to a homeless woman for a stained hoodie and a warning about which areas to avoid after dark. The public library became my sanctuary during daylight hours, where I could use the restrooms to wash my face and hands with paper towels, pretending to study while actually trying to stay warm and invisible, until closing time forced me back onto the streets. Food became an obsession that consumed every waking thought. I learned which restaurants threw away perfectly good meals at closing time, and which dumpsters were monitored by security cameras. The hunger was constant, a gnawing emptiness that made concentration impossible and sleep elusive. My stomach cramped during the coldest nights as I huddled in doorways, counting the hours until morning when I could return to the library and continue my careful rationing of the granola bars I'd managed to acquire. The first time I stole a sandwich from a convenience store, my hands shook so violently I nearly dropped it, but desperation had eroded the moral boundaries my privileged upbringing had instilled. 3 weeks into my life on the streets, Nina Delgado found me rifling through the dumpster behind a pizza place near downtown. She was 21, had been homeless since aging out of foster care, and possessed a street wisdom that my expensive education had never provided. "You're doing it wrong," she said, not unkindly, watching me struggle with a garbage bag. "Health department requires them to throw away whole pizzas if they sit under the heat lamps too long. Come back at 11 p.m. when they close and you'll find better stuff on top." Her dark eyes assessed my condition with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood exactly how quickly circumstances could deteriorate. Nina introduced me to the unspoken rules of survival that governed life on the margins. Which shelter workers could be trusted, and which ones demanded favors in exchange for a bed. How to layer newspaper underclothing for insulation during winter nights. Where to find day labor jobs that paid cash and didn't require permanent addresses or identification verification. She taught me to recognize the signs of predators who targeted vulnerable young women, the fake kindness that masked exploitation, the offers of help that came with strings attached that could destroy what little safety we managed to create. The Riverside shelter became our temporary refuge during the harshest winter nights, though the conditions inside often felt more dangerous than the streets. Mr. Cray, the night manager, was a thin man in his 50s who enjoyed exercising power over people who had nowhere else to go. He rationed blankets and bathroom access, created arbitrary rules that changed based on his moods, and made comments about the younger women that everyone heard but no one dared challenge. Nina warned me to avoid being alone with him, to always use the bathroom with other women present, and to sleep with my shoes on in case we needed to leave quickly. After 2 months of survival mode, I finally gathered enough courage to apply for legitimate work despite having no permanent address. The first dozen rejections stung, but Nina had taught me that persistence mattered more than pride when hunger was the alternative. DrakeSync Technologies needed someone for their mailroom, a position that required showing up on time, following simple instructions, and maintaining basic hygiene standards. The building was 43 stories of glass and steel in the financial district, representing a world that felt impossibly distant from the doorways where I'd been sleeping. My interview with the mailroom supervisor lasted exactly 7 minutes. He asked about my availability, my ability to lift packages, and whether I had any criminal history that would prevent me from handling corporate mail. I wore the cleanest clothes I owned, had washed my hair in the library bathroom that morning, and tried to project the competence my expensive education had supposedly provided. When he offered me the position at $8 per hour, I accepted before he finished outlining the responsibilities, grateful for any opportunity to rebuild some semblance of stability. The mailroom occupied a basement level that smelled like toner cartridges and industrial carpet cleaner. My job involved sorting incoming packages, distributing interdepartment mail, and operating the copy machines for various administrative tasks. The work was monotonous, but provided structure to days that had been defined by uncertainty and fear. More importantly, it offered access to employee bathrooms, a locker where I could store clean clothes, and a steady paycheck that meant I could occasionally afford actual meals instead of relying on dumpster diving and food banks. My coworkers were mostly older women who had worked in the building for decades, treating the mailroom like their personal kingdom with established hierarchies and unspoken protocols. They viewed me with suspicion initially, wondering why someone so young would take such a low-pay position in a company known for hiring ambitious college graduates for better positions. I kept my background vague, claiming I was saving money for school while figuring out my long-term plans, which wasn't entirely untrue, even if it omitted the more dramatic elements of my circumstances. Living in the shelter while working at Drakesink created a strange double existence where I spent my days surrounded by corporate efficiency and my nights navigating the chaos of institutionalized poverty. Nina helped me establish a routine that maximized my chances of maintaining employment while managing the unpredictable demands of shelter life. We took turns watching each other's possessions, shared information about job opportunities, and provided emotional support during the moments when the weight of our circumstances threatened to overwhelm our carefully maintained optimism. 3 months into my employment, I was restocking paper supplies on the 15th floor when I overheard a conversation that would change everything. 2 executives were discussing a system glitch that had corrupted weeks of financial data, threatening to delay a major acquisition that could cost the company millions in penalties and lost opportunities. They stood near the elevator, voices carrying frustration and panic as they debated whether their IT department could recover the information in time to meet critical deadlines. I listened while organizing supply closets, my mind already formulating potential solutions based on data recovery techniques I'd learned during high school computer science classes that suddenly seemed more valuable than anything else my expensive education had provided. The conversation about the corrupted financial data haunted me through my remaining hours on the 15th floor. I'd studied database architecture and recovery protocols during my senior year computer science courses, subjects that had seemed theoretical and irrelevant when my biggest concern was choosing which designer dress to wear to graduation parties. Now, hearing the panic in those executives' voices as they discussed potential solutions, I realized my privileged education might finally serve a purpose beyond impressing college admissions committees or satisfying my parents' expectations for academic achievement. That evening, I researched Drakesink Technologies using the library's computers, discovering details about the company I'd never bothered to learn despite working there for 3 months. The CEO was Silas Drake, a 32-year-old tech prodigy who had built his empire through innovative software solutions and strategic acquisitions. His photograph showed a man with dark hair and intense eyes, someone who projected confidence and intelligence in the calculated way that successful entrepreneurs cultivated for public consumption. The company specialized in data management systems for Fortune 500 corporations, exactly the type of complex infrastructure that would make a system corruption both devastating and technically challenging to resolve. I spent the weekend drafting a detailed proposal outlining potential recovery strategies using knowledge I'd accumulated from computer science classes combined with research I conducted using the library's internet access. The solution involved implementing parallel recovery protocols while maintaining system integrity, a process that required understanding both the technical architecture and the business priorities driving the timeline constraints. My proposal was probably naive and oversimplified, but it represented genuine effort from someone who understood the urgency of their situation and wanted to contribute something meaningful beyond sorting mail and restocking copy paper. Monday morning, I waited near the executive elevator until I spotted one of the men I'd overheard discussing the crisis. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to making important decisions under pressure. When he emerged from the elevator, I approached carefully, my heart racing with anxiety about overstepping boundaries that separated mailroom employees from corporate executives in ways that went far beyond simple hierarchy. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm Callie from the mailroom. I overheard your conversation about the data corruption issue on Friday, and I think I might have some suggestions that could help." His expression shifted from polite confusion to surprised interest as I handed him the printed proposal I'd spent the weekend perfecting. He scanned the first page quickly, his eyebrows rising as he encountered technical terminology that probably seemed incongruous coming from someone whose official job involved distributing inter-department memos. "You wrote this?" he asked, studying my face with newfound attention. "Where did you study computer science?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications about my background and qualifications that I wasn't prepared to address honestly. I mumbled something about community college courses and self-directed learning, hoping he wouldn't probe deeper into educational credentials that would reveal the expensive private school background I'd been hiding since starting work at Drake Sync. He introduced himself as Marcus Chen, the Chief Technology Officer, and asked if I could explain my proposed solution in more detail. We found an empty conference room where I outlined the recovery strategy using the whiteboard to illustrate database relationships and backup protocols. As I spoke, I watched his expression change from polite skepticism to genuine engagement, and finally to something approaching excitement as he grasped the implications of what I was suggesting. "This could actually work," he said, studying the diagrams I'd drawn. "Have you implemented anything like this before?" I admitted that my experience was purely theoretical, but emphasized my willingness to assist with the implementation under proper supervision. Marcus made several phone calls, and within an hour, I found myself in a much larger conference room, surrounded by senior IT staff, who peppered me with technical questions that tested the depth of my understanding. The next 3 days blurred together as I worked alongside Drake Sync's technology team to implement the recovery solution. I officially remained a mailroom employee, but spent my actual time in meetings with database administrators and system architects who seemed genuinely impressed by my contributions to their problem-solving process. The work was exhausting and exhilarating, requiring me to think creatively about complex technical challenges while learning sophisticated systems in real time under intense deadline pressure. When the recovery process succeeded, restoring the corrupted financial data with minimal loss and allowing the acquisition to proceed on schedule, Marcus insisted on introducing me to the broader executive team. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon in the main boardroom, a glass-walled space on the 42nd floor that I'd only seen from the outside when delivering mail to nearby offices. I wore my best clothes, which still looked shabby compared to the expensive suits surrounding me, and tried to project confidence despite feeling completely out of place among people whose yearly salaries probably exceeded my lifetime earnings. Silas Drake entered the boardroom exactly on time, and I recognized him immediately from the photographs I'd studied online. He was taller than I'd expected, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without obvious effort. His questions about the recovery process were intelligent and specific, demonstrating technical knowledge that went far beyond typical CEO understanding of operational details. When he asked about my background and future plans, I gave the same vague answers I'd been rehearsing for months, hoping to avoid discussions about my actual circumstances. "We should talk more," he said after the meeting concluded. "Would you be interested in joining our IT department officially? We could use someone with your problem-solving abilities and fresh perspective." The offer felt surreal, a dramatic shift from mailroom duties to corporate responsibility that seemed too good to be true. I accepted immediately, though part of me worried about maintaining the careful balance between my professional opportunities and my evening reality of shelter life and survival strategies. My new position came with a significant salary increase and access to company benefits I'd never expected to receive. For the first time since leaving my parents' house, I could afford to rent a small studio apartment, buy adequate food, and maintain the professional appearance necessary for corporate success. Nina was thrilled about my advancement, though I could see the worry in her eyes about our friendship surviving the class differences that were rapidly developing between us. The transition from homeless teenager to Drakesync employee felt like inhabiting someone else's life, constantly requiring me to navigate social expectations I'd learned to avoid during my time on the streets. My new colleagues were friendly, but inhabited a world of graduate degrees and family connections that I couldn't relate to honestly without revealing details about my background that would raise uncomfortable questions. I found myself creating careful stories about my education and family situation, building a professional identity that bore little resemblance to my actual experiences. 3 weeks into my new position, Silas began stopping by my desk regularly to discuss current projects and potential improvements to existing systems. Our conversations were professional, but felt more personal than typical supervisor interactions, and I noticed him asking questions about my opinions and perspectives that went beyond immediate work responsibilities. He seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts about technology trends and business strategies, treating me like a colleague rather than a recent hire who'd been promoted from the mailroom under unusual circumstances. The first time he invited me to lunch, I almost declined, worried about the appearance of favoritism and the potential complications of socializing with the CEO while still learning to navigate corporate culture. But something about his manner suggested the invitation was genuine rather than obligatory, and I found myself accepting despite my anxiety about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries in a situation that already felt precarious given my unconventional path to employment. The lunch with Silas took place at a small cafe 3 blocks from the Drakesync building, far enough from the corporate environment to feel casual, but close enough to maintain professional boundaries. He arrived exactly on time, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and dark jeans that made him look younger and more approachable than the commanding presence he projected in boardroom meetings. Our conversation started with work topics, but gradually shifted to more personal subjects as we discovered shared interests in technology innovation and problem-solving approaches that went beyond typical employee-supervisor discussions. "You have an unusual perspective on systems design," he said, studying my face with an intensity that made me self-conscious about maintaining eye contact. "Most people with your technical abilities come from traditional computer science programs, but your approach is more intuitive, more creative. Where did that come from?" The question forced me to navigate carefully between honesty and the professional image I'd been constructing, offering vague references to self-directed learning and practical experience, while avoiding details about the circumstances that had shaped my unconventional educational path. Over the following weeks, our lunch meetings became a regular occurrence, though Silas was careful to include other team members occasionally to avoid the appearance of inappropriate favoritism. I learned that he'd started Drakesync straight out of college with a small loan and relentless determination, building the company through 18-hour workdays and strategic risks that had either paid off spectacularly or nearly destroyed everything he'd worked to create. His success story felt both inspiring and intimidating, representing the kind of focused ambition I'd never been allowed to develop under my parents' suffocating control. The other employees in our department began treating me differently, as my relationship with Silas evolved from professional necessity to something approaching genuine friendship. Zoe, Hunter, and Amira, 3 colleagues who'd been hired around the same time from prestigious graduate programs, started making subtle comments about my rapid advancement and access to executive-level discussions they weren't included in. Their jealousy manifested in small acts of sabotage, like forgetting to include me in important email chains or scheduling meetings during times when they knew I had other commitments. "Some people think you're getting special treatment," Zoe mentioned casually one afternoon, her tone carrying just enough sweetness to disguise the warning underneath. "Not that anyone's complaining, of course. We all know how talented you are." The comment lingered in my mind for days, making me hyper-aware of every interaction with Silas and second-guessing whether my professional achievements were being viewed as legitimate or as the result of favoritism I hadn't earned through merit alone. My relationship with Nina became increasingly complicated as my circumstances improved and hers remained stagnant. She was genuinely happy about my success, but I could see the pain behind her congratulations when I mentioned apartment hunting or described the corporate culture I was slowly learning to navigate. The gap between our daily realities was widening in ways that made our friendship feel strained, despite our mutual affection and shared history of survival on the streets. "You're different now," Nina observed one evening as we sat in the park near the shelter, where she still spent most nights. "Not bad different, just different. You talk about work stuff I don't understand, and you worry about things like office politics instead of where your next meal is coming from." Her words stung because they were accurate, forcing me to confront how quickly I'd adapted to concerns that would have seemed absurd during my first months of homelessness. Silas and I were working late one Thursday evening debugging a complex system integration that required both technical expertise and creative problem-solving when our professional collaboration shifted into something more personal. The office was empty except for security guards, and we'd ordered dinner to be delivered to the conference room, where we'd spread out documentation and laptops across every available surface. Between discussions of database architecture and user interface design, we began sharing stories about our backgrounds and motivations that went far beyond typical workplace conversation. "I've never met anyone who approaches problems the way you do," he said, leaning back in his chair and studying me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "You see solutions that the rest of us miss completely. Like you're thinking about systems from a fundamentally different angle." His observation was more perceptive than he realized, though I couldn't explain that my unconventional perspective came from learning to navigate survival situations that required constant adaptation and creative resource management. When he asked about my family and background, I found myself sharing more truth than I'd intended, describing parents who valued control over affection, and a childhood that prioritized appearances over genuine connection. I omitted the details about the forced marriage contract and my current homelessness, but conveyed enough about my family dynamics to help him understand why I was so determined to build an independent life through my own abilities, rather than relying on external support systems. "My parents wanted me to marry someone they'd chosen for business reasons," I admitted, surprised by my own honesty. "When I refused, they decided I was no longer part of the family. That's why I'm so focused on building something for myself, something they can't take away or control." Silas listened without judgment, his expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching anger as he processed the implications of what I was describing. 3 months into our evolving relationship, Silas began inviting me to company events and client dinners where my presence served both professional and personal purposes. I was still learning to navigate the social expectations of corporate entertainment, feeling constantly aware of my lack of experience with the cultural references and social conventions that came naturally to people who'd grown up in similar environments. The expensive restaurants and exclusive venues represented a world I'd observed from the outside, but never actually inhabited, despite my family's wealth during my childhood. The board of directors at Drake Sink began expressing concerns about Silas's increasingly visible relationship with a recent hire whose background didn't match their expectations for someone in my position. Ms. Whitmore, Mr. Lansing, and Dr. Cho scheduled private meetings with him to discuss the potential risks of workplace relationships and the importance of maintaining professional boundaries that protected both the company's reputation and his personal liability as CEO. "They think I'm a gall digger," I told Silas after overhearing part of a conversation between Miss Whitmore and another board member. "They assume I'm using my relationship with you to advance my career, unfairly." The accusation hurt because it diminished both my professional abilities and the genuine connection we'd developed, reducing everything to a calculated manipulation that bore no resemblance to my actual feelings or motivations. Silas's response surprised me with its intensity and determination. The next board meeting included a presentation about my contributions to major projects, complete with metrics demonstrating the value I'd brought to the company independent of any personal relationship. He defended my qualifications and achievements with a passion that silenced the whispered criticisms and forced the board to acknowledge that their concerns were based on assumptions rather than performance data. "I don't care what they think," he told me afterward, his voice carrying a conviction that made my heart race with emotions I'd been trying to suppress. "You've earned your place here through talent and hard work, and anyone who can't see that is letting their prejudices cloud their judgment." The moment felt like a turning point, not just in our professional relationship, but in something deeper that neither of us had been willing to acknowledge until the external pressure forced us to confront our true feelings. That evening, as we walked through the city after another late night at the office, Silas stopped suddenly and turned to face me with an expression of nervous determination that seemed incongruous with his usual confidence. "Callie," Silas said, his voice carrying an uncertainty I'd never heard before, "I know this complicates everything, but I can't pretend anymore that what's happening between us is just professional collaboration or friendship." The streetlights cast shadows across his face as he spoke, and I could see him struggling with the implications of crossing boundaries we'd both been carefully maintaining for months. "I'm falling in love with you, and I think you feel the same way, but I need to know if I'm reading this situation completely wrong." His confession hung in the evening air between us, forcing me to confront emotions I'd been suppressing since our first lunch meeting. The professional relationship had provided safe boundaries for feelings that terrified me with their intensity, and acknowledging them meant risking the stability I'd fought so desperately to achieve. Everything I'd built since leaving my parents' house felt precarious, dependent on maintaining careful control over circumstances that could change without warning. And love represented the kind of vulnerability I wasn't sure I could afford. "I feel the same way," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm scared about what this means for both of us. The board already thinks I'm using you for advancement, and if our relationship becomes public knowledge, it could destroy everything we've both worked for." The fear in my voice reflected deeper anxieties about worthiness and belonging that my time on the streets had intensified rather than resolved, making me question whether someone with my background deserved the happiness he was offering. Our relationship evolved slowly and carefully over the following months, conducted largely in private to avoid feeding the corporate gossip that already surrounded my rapid advancement within the company. We found ways to spend time together outside the office, taking long walks through the city, having dinner at quiet restaurants where we were unlikely to encounter Drake Sync employees, and gradually building the foundation of trust that both of us needed to navigate the complexities of our situation. Silas was patient with my reluctance to discuss certain aspects of my background, accepting vague explanations about family estrangement without pushing for details I wasn't ready to share. He seemed to understand intuitively that my past contained painful elements I was still processing, and he focused instead on building a future that could accommodate whatever secrets I needed to protect. His approach felt radically different from my family's constant demands for explanation and justification, offering acceptance without conditions that made vulnerability feel possible rather than dangerous. The challenges of maintaining a secret relationship while working together daily required constant vigilance about our interactions in professional settings. We developed subtle communication systems and learned to maintain appropriate distance during meetings and corporate events, though the effort of hiding our feelings sometimes felt more exhausting than the technical work we were supposed to be focusing on. The deception bothered both of us, but neither could see a path toward public acknowledgement that wouldn't create significant professional complications. 6 months into our hidden relationship, Silas suggested we take a weekend trip to his cabin in the mountains, the first time we'd planned to spend extended private time together away from the city and its constant reminders of corporate politics. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, surrounded by pine trees and situated near a lake that reflected the changing colors of autumn leaves. For 3 days, we could pretend that external pressures didn't exist, focusing entirely on each other without worrying about who might observe our interactions or draw conclusions about our relationship. "I want to marry you," he said on our last evening at the cabin, the words emerging spontaneously as we sat by the fireplace sharing wine and conversation that had meandered through topics we'd never had time to explore properly. "I know it's complicated with work and your family situation and everything else, but I can't imagine building a life without you in it." His proposal was informal but heartfelt, delivered with the same directness that characterized his approach to business challenges. My response was delayed by the flood of emotions his words triggered. Memories of my parents' transactional approach to marriage colliding with the genuine love I felt for this man who saw value in me beyond my utility to his ambitions. "Yes," I said, finally, surprised by the certainty in my voice, despite all the practical complications we would need to navigate. "But we need to do this carefully, in a way that protects both of us and doesn't give anyone ammunition to use against us professionally." We decided on a small, private ceremony with minimal publicity, understanding that keeping our marriage secret initially would allow us to establish our relationship on solid ground before dealing with the corporate and social complications that would inevitably follow. Silas had contacts who could arrange a discreet wedding, and we began planning a celebration that reflected our desire for authenticity rather than the elaborate social performance my parents would have demanded. The wedding took place on a Saturday morning in a small chapel outside the city, with only Nina and Marcus Chen as witnesses to our exchange of vows. I wore a simple dress I'd purchased specifically for the occasion. The first time since leaving my parents' house that I'd bought clothing for celebration, rather than necessity or professional requirement. Nina cried during the ceremony, emotional about witnessing my transformation from the desperate teenager she'd found stealing food to a woman building a life of her own choosing. "You deserve this happiness," she whispered as she hugged me after the ceremony concluded. "Don't let anyone make you feel guilty about how far you've come or question whether you've earned the love you've found." Her words carried the weight of our shared history and the understanding that few people would ever comprehend the journey that had brought me to this moment of unexpected joy and hope for the future. Our honeymoon was a brief trip to a coastal town where we could walk on the beach and eat at small restaurants without worrying about recognition or professional implications. For 5 days, we existed in a bubble of normalcy that felt almost surreal after the careful secrecy that had characterized our relationship development. Silas was attentive and affectionate in ways that helped heal some of the emotional damage my family had inflicted through years of conditional love and transactional relationships. Returning to work as a married couple required adjustments to our professional dynamic that tested our ability to maintain appropriate boundaries while honoring the commitment we'd made to each other. We agreed to continue keeping our marriage private until we could determine the best strategy for public disclosure, though the deception felt increasingly uncomfortable as our relationship deepened and the desire to share our happiness with colleagues and friends became harder to suppress. 2 months after our wedding, the press syndicate began investigating rumors about Silas's personal life, apparently tipped off by someone with access to corporate information who had noticed changes in his behavior and schedule. The possibility of unwanted media attention forced us to confront the reality that our secret couldn't be maintained indefinitely, and we began discussing how to control the narrative when public disclosure became inevitable. "Whatever happens with the press or the board, we'll handle it together," Silas assured me, as we prepared for what felt like an approaching storm of public scrutiny and corporate politics that could threaten everything we'd built, both professionally and personally. The call from Silas's assistant came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing system architecture plans in my office. "Mrs. Drake," she said, the title still feeling foreign despite 3 months of marriage. "There's been a development with the press situation. Silas needs to see you in his office immediately." The urgency in her voice sent anxiety coursing through my system as I gathered my materials and tried to prepare mentally for whatever crisis had materialized while I'd been focused on routine technical work. The press syndicate had published a preliminary article about Silas's mysterious new relationship with unnamed sources, claiming he'd been seen with a young employee at various locations around the city. The piece was carefully worded to avoid legal liability while strongly implying impropriety and potential abuse of corporate power. Photographs taken with telephoto lenses showed us entering restaurants and walking through downtown streets, images that looked incriminating when presented without context about our actual relationship status. "We need to get ahead of this," Silas said, his jaw tight with controlled anger as he showed me the article on his laptop screen. "If we let them control the narrative, they'll turn our marriage into a scandal about workplace harassment and corporate corruption. We have to announce our marriage publicly and provide enough details to counteract their implications without feeding their appetite for sensationalized drama." The decision felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying, representing the end of our carefully maintained privacy and the beginning of public scrutiny neither of us had wanted to invite. The board meeting that afternoon was tense and uncomfortable, with Ms. Whitmore, Mr. Lansing, and Dr. Cho expressing concerns about the potential impact of negative publicity on Drake Sync's reputation and stock price. Their questions focused primarily on legal liability and corporate policy violations, treating our relationship as a business problem to be managed rather than a personal commitment between two adults who happened to work for the same company. The optics are problematic, Duck Cho stated bluntly, her clinical tone reducing our marriage to a public relations challenge. A CEO marrying a recent hire who was promoted rapidly from the mailroom creates appearance issues that could affect investor confidence and employee morale. We need to consider whether structural changes to corporate leadership might be necessary to protect the company's interests. Her suggestion that Silas might need to step down felt like a direct attack on both our professional achievements and personal happiness. Silas's response was measured but firm, presenting documentation of my contributions to major projects and the timeline of our relationship development that demonstrated ethical behavior throughout our professional collaboration. Kelly earned her position through talent and performance metrics that exceed most employees with traditional backgrounds, he stated, his voice carrying the authority that had built DrakeSync into an industry leader. Any suggestion that our marriage compromises her qualifications or my judgment reflects bias rather than legitimate business concerns. The media attention intensified over the following days as more outlets picked up the story, each adding speculative details and anonymous quotes that painted increasingly unflattering pictures of our relationship. Social media commentary ranged from supportive to viciously critical, with strangers making assumptions about my motivations and character based on incomplete information filtered through sensationalized reporting designed to generate clicks rather than convey truth. Some people are calling you a gall digger, Nina mentioned during one of our evening phone calls, her voice carrying protective anger about the public criticism I was receiving. Others are saying Silas is taking advantage of a vulnerable employee. It's all garbage, but it must be hard to read about yourself that way. The disconnect between public perception and private reality felt surreal, watching my life become entertainment for people who knew nothing about the actual circumstances of our relationship. 3 weeks after the initial article, I suggested to Silas that we make a strategic visit to my hometown, both to demonstrate the stability of our marriage and to address unfinished business with my family that had been weighing on my mind since our wedding. I think it's time they understood what I've built without them, I told him, the idea forming as I spoke. And maybe seeing us together will help people understand that our relationship isn't what the media is portraying. The decision to return to my parents' house felt like closing a circle that had been left incomplete since the night they'd thrown me out 7 years earlier. Silas was supportive but cautious, understanding that confronting my family could trigger emotional responses I'd been avoiding since building my new life. We planned the visit carefully, approaching it as both a personal milestone and a public relations opportunity that could help reshape the narrative surrounding our marriage. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Silas asked as we prepared for the trip, his concern evident in the way he studied my face for signs of anxiety or second thoughts. "We don't have to prove anything to anyone, especially not to people who treated you so badly when you needed their support most." His protective instincts made me love him even more. But I felt a deep need to demonstrate both to my family and to myself that I'd transcended the limitations they'd tried to impose on my life. The Rolls Royce was Silas's idea, a calculated display of success that would immediately communicate our financial status and social position to anyone who witnessed our arrival. "If we're going to make a statement," he said with a slight smile, "we might as well make it impossible to ignore." The car represented everything my parents valued superficially, while symbolizing achievements they'd never believed I could accomplish independently. As we drove through the familiar neighborhoods of my childhood, memories flooded back with unexpected intensity. The private schools where I'd been educated to attract the right kind of husband. The country club where my parents had displayed their wealth and social connections. The exclusive shops where Eleanor had taken me for clothing that reflected our family's status rather than my personal preferences. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, less impressive when viewed through the lens of genuine accomplishment rather than inherited privilege. The house appeared unchanged from the outside, its imposing colonial architecture designed to project old money respectability and social prominence. The circular driveway could easily accommodate the Rolls Royce, though I wondered if my parents would recognize the significance of our arrival or simply assume we were guests attending one of Eleanor's social gatherings. 7 years of separation had passed without any communication, leaving me uncertain about what reception to expect or whether they'd even agree to see us. Silas parked directly in front of the main entrance, the car's presence impossible to miss from any window facing the driveway. "Ready?" he asked, reaching for my hand with a squeeze that reminded me I wasn't facing this confrontation alone. The support felt transformative compared to the isolation I'd experienced during my last visit to this house, when I'd torn up Barrett Langley's marriage contract and chosen homelessness over surrender to my parents' transactional view of love and family. I rang the doorbell with steady hands, my heart racing despite the confidence I'd built through 7 years of independence and professional success. The door opened to reveal a woman I barely recognized as my mother. Eleanor's hair had gone completely gray, styled shorter than the elaborate arrangements she'd maintained during my childhood, and her face showed lines of stress that expensive skincare routines couldn't entirely conceal. She stared at me for several seconds, her expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and something approaching shock as she processed the transformation that 7 years had brought to her abandoned daughter. "Callie," she said, her voice uncertain as she took in my professional attire, confident posture, and the obvious quality of the clothing and jewelry I wore. Behind her, I could hear the familiar sounds of the house, television playing in the living room, and the distant clatter of dishes being prepared for dinner. "What are you doing here?" Her question carried no warmth, but lacked the hostility I'd expected, suggesting that time had blunted the sharp edges of anger that had characterized our last interaction. "Hello, Mother," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotional turbulence her presence triggered. "I'd like you to meet my husband, Silas Drake." The word husband seemed to hit her like a physical blow, her eyes widening as she processed the implications of what I'd said. She looked past me to where Silas stood beside the Rolls Royce, his expensive suit and confident bearing communicating wealth and status in the language my parents understood better than affection or personal achievement. Eleanor called for Damien, her voice carrying the sharp edge of urgency that had always accompanied family crises or unexpected social complications. My father appeared within moments, his hair thinner and his frame slightly stooped with age, but his eyes still carrying the calculating assessment that had characterized every interaction I remembered from childhood. When he saw me standing on his doorstep, his expression shifted through the same progression of emotions Eleanor had displayed, ending with a wariness that suggested he understood this wasn't a simple reconciliation visit. "Callista," he said, using my full name in the formal tone he'd always employed when discussing serious family matters. "We weren't expecting you." His gaze moved to Silas, taking in details that would allow him to evaluate our financial status and social position with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd built a career on reading people's circumstances accurately. The Rolls Royce in his driveway was impossible to ignore, representing the kind of wealth that commanded his immediate attention and respect. "May we come in?" I asked, maintaining the polite formality that had governed our family interactions, even during moments of greatest conflict. "We have some things to discuss that would be better handled privately than on your front doorstep." Eleanor stepped aside reluctantly, her movement suggesting discomfort with the unexpected disruption to whatever evening routine they'd established in my absence. The living room looked exactly as I remembered it. Expensive furniture arranged for display rather than comfort, family photographs carefully positioned to project an image of success and unity that had never reflected our actual relationships. Notably absent were any pictures of me, as if I'd been systematically erased from the family narrative following my departure 7 years earlier. The omission stung more than I'd expected, though it also confirmed my suspicions about how thoroughly they'd written me out of their lives. Silas introduced himself with the confident authority he brought to business negotiations, offering details about Drake Singh Technologies and his role as CEO without appearing boastful or defensive. I watched my parents' expressions change as they processed the implications of his wealth and corporate position, their attitudes shifting from wary hostility to calculating interest as they reassessed the situation they were confronting. "You've done well for yourself," Damien said, addressing me directly for the first time since we'd entered the house. "Though I notice you haven't contacted us in 7 years. We assumed you were still struggling somewhere. probably blaming us for your difficulties instead of taking responsibility for your own choices. His words carried the familiar sting of emotional manipulation, attempting to reframe my absence as selfishness rather than self-preservation. I wasn't struggling, I replied, my voice carrying quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the desperate teenager who'd left this house with nothing but the clothes on her back. I built a successful career in technology, met and married a wonderful man, and created a life that brings me genuine happiness. I haven't contacted you because I didn't need your approval or support to accomplish any of that. The statement felt liberating, finally articulating truths I'd carried silently for years. Eleanor's expression showed confusion and something approaching hurt as she processed my words. "We tried to find you," she said, her voice defensive. "After a few months, when you didn't come home, we hired investigators and made inquiries, but you disappeared completely, like you didn't want to be found." Her version of events conveniently omitted the cruel texts and deliberate abandonment that had precipitated my disappearance, rewriting history to cast themselves as concerned parents, rather than people who'd literally thrown their daughter away. "You didn't try to find me," I corrected her, my voice calm but firm. "You told me to leave and never come back. You cut off my apartment and blocked my phone calls. The only thing you investigated was how to make my abandonment seem like my choice rather than your cruelty." The accuracy of my recollection clearly made them both uncomfortable, forcing them to confront actions they'd probably rationalized or forgotten entirely during my absence. Silas had remained silent during this exchange, allowing me to handle the confrontation in my own way while providing quiet support through his presence. When Damien began to argue about their version of events, Silas spoke for the first time since our introductions. "I'd like to make you a business proposition," he said, his tone carrying the authority that had built his corporate empire. "Drakesync Technologies is acquiring several smaller companies in this region, and we're looking for local partners who understand the market dynamics." The offer hung in the air between us, its implications clear to everyone present. Silas was dangling exactly the kind of financial opportunity my parents had always prioritized, but now they were in the position of supplicants rather than the controlling authorities they'd been when I lived under their roof. The power dynamic had shifted completely, with wealth and success flowing through me rather than being dispensed by their conditional approval. "Of course, any business relationship would depend on personal factors," Silas continued, his eyes meeting mine with understanding about what I needed to accomplish during this visit. "My wife's happiness and comfort are my primary concerns, and I wouldn't want to complicate her family relationships with professional obligations that might create additional stress or conflict." His message was clear. Their access to his business opportunities depended entirely on how they chose to treat me going forward. Damien's face showed the internal struggle between pride and financial pragmatism that had always governed his decision-making process. Eleanor looked between us, with growing comprehension about the reversal of circumstances that had brought their formerly powerless daughter back to their house as someone who controlled access to opportunities they desperately needed. The recession had clearly affected their finances, evidenced by subtle signs of reduced household staff and delayed maintenance I'd noticed since arriving. "We made mistakes," Eleanor said finally, her voice carrying a humility I'd never heard before. "When you were younger, we thought we were preparing you for the real world, teaching you to be strong and independent. The arrangement with Barrett Langley was supposed to provide security and stability, not force you into something you didn't want." Her attempt at revisionist history was pathetic, but represented more acknowledgement of wrongdoing than I'd ever expected to receive. "Barrett Langley was a predator," I said bluntly, "and you tried to sell me to him like livestock. That wasn't about my security or independence. That was about solving your financial problems using my body as collateral." The harsh truth silenced both of them, forcing acknowledgement of realities they'd spent years avoiding through careful self-deception and social rationalization. The conversation continued for another hour, with my parents gradually accepting the new dynamic where I held the power to grant or withhold opportunities they needed. Silas outlined potential business arrangements that could provide them with financial stability while ensuring they understood these opportunities existed solely because of their relationship to me. The reversal felt both satisfying and hollow, proving I'd transcended their limitations while highlighting how transactional their approach to relationships remained even now. As we prepared to leave, I looked around the living room one final time, noting how small and ordinary it seemed compared to the intimidating fortress of my childhood memories. "I forgave you both years ago," I told them, surprised by the truth of those words as I spoke them, "not because you deserved forgiveness, but because carrying anger was holding me back from building the life I wanted." But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean pretending our relationship can return to something it never actually was. Standing beside the Rolls Royce as Silas started the engine, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. The scared 17-year-old who'd been abandoned at a gas station had become a woman capable of facing her past without being diminished by it, strong enough to offer mercy from a position of genuine power rather than desperate need for approval.